began, the Philippine archipelago was only 1,500 miles distant. Lying directly in the path of a Japanese southward thrust, the Philippines were an obvious target if war should come. Japanese interest in the Philippines was apparent long before war erupted in the Pacific world. Thousands of Japanese had settled in the Philippines and had managed to make a fair living in the islands. The bond between the two Oriental peoples was stronger than most Westerners realized in the years which preceded the war. Relations between the Japanese and Filipinos were, for the most part, friendly. In many ways, the Japanese contributed to Philippine development. They conducted experiments in the planting and cultivation of abaca, from which hemp is made. The introduction by the Japanese of improved methods of stripping and baling the product helped stabilize the hemp industry. The Japanese produced more than 1/4 of all Philippine hemp, and it was largely top-grade hemp. Many industrious Japanese immigrants were among the most successful fishermen in the Philippines. Even the Filipinos admitted that the average Japanese fisherman was the equal of about 8 Filipinos. But the commercial activities of the Japanese were looked on with a considerable degree of suspicion by many Filipinos. Others considered the rumors about the Japanese fantastic. Of greater concern to a large percentage of the native population was the progress being made toward Philippine independence. The islands had been moving slowly toward that national freedom for several decades. These stirrings were stimulated by alert statesmen like Manuel Quezon, who had represented the Philippine territory in Washington from 1909 to 1916, and Sergio Osmeña, an attorney who had become Speaker of the Territory's Assembly. In the 1930s, Quezon developed into the most popular political figure in the islands. In November 1935, in Manila, the inauguration of the first president of the Philippine Commonwealth was celebrated before an audience of several representatives of the U.S. government and a gathering of proud Filipinos whose dreams of independence were gradually coming true. President Quezon worked toward the extension of the Philippine educational facilities. The University of the Philippines was to be the molder of the Filipino mind, was to produce men and women of character and wisdom trained in the arts and sciences, men and women who could assume leadership in the embryonic Philippine Republic. Philippine education had benefited enormously by U.S. supervision. The public school system, organized soon after the Americans took Manila, had been modified during the 1930s to meet the needs of new generations of Philippine citizens. The judicial system, which was established in the Philippines during the American regime, was patterned after that which existed under Spanish rule. In certain types of cases, a decision of the Philippine Supreme Court could be appealed to the U.S. Supreme Court. In 1934, it was ordered further that all cases involving the Constitution of the new Commonwealth be subject to review by the U.S. Court. In 1940, a bicameral legislature was provided for in a series of amendments to the Constitution. The Commonwealth's government now closely resembled in structure the government of the United States. Gradually, the Philippines were approaching the capacity for self-government. In the 1940 amendments, the term of office of the Commonwealth's president was shortened to 4 years. Like the U.S. president, the Philippine chief executive acted with the authority vested in him by a vote of the people. The Philippine president was granted broad executive powers to enable him to rule effectively in critical periods. But Philippine capabilities for defending the islands throughout the 1930s were slight indeed. Filipinos were thrilled by parades and martial music. But even in 1940, the Commonwealth president was openly pessimistic about the country's ability to defend itself successfully against a strong aggressor. The Philippine Army was being enlarged by some 40,000 conscripts a year. But at that rate of expansion, the desired strength of the Philippine Reserve, 400,000 men, would not be achieved until 1946. In 1940, there were some 6,000 Philippine scouts on active duty in the pay of the U.S. government. In this service, Filipino enlisted men served principally under American officers in a specially created unit of the U.S. Army. The most adept Filipinos graduated from the ranks to the status of commissioned officers in this highly efficient branch of America's military complement in the islands. At the head of the Philippine forces as Field Marshal since 1937, General Douglas MacArthur was placed in command of the combined Philippine and U.S. forces in the Philippine Islands in July 1941. The creation of this command by the U.S. bolstered the confidence of the Philippines in America's intentions toward the islands. Philippine Cadets, modeled on the West Point product, cut an impressive figure in the waning months of 1941. The military academy men were well disciplined and well trained in the essentials of their profession. But for the defense of the Philippines, most of the manpower would be drawn from the reserves. In 1941, the reserve force numbered some 130,000 men. But they were still not completely familiar after 5 months of active training with the weapons and techniques of modern warfare.
Ready? Fire!
To supplement U.S. Army forces in the Philippines, the 4th Marine Regiment had arrived from its China station in early December 1941. The U.S. Air Force in the Pacific, which had consisted of a handful of obsolete planes in 1939, was strengthened by the addition of several shipments of new planes during 1941. For the defense of the islands in the fall of that fateful year, the U.S. Far East Air Force had 123 aircraft in operating condition, 33 of them bombers. Naval bases in the Philippines were far from adequate for defense needs. Cavite on Manila Bay could not have serviced a wartime fleet. Although this Navy yard served as home base for the U.S. Asiatic Fleet in late 1941, it was generally considered to be insecure in the event of war with Japan. As the situation grew more threatening, the men of the Asiatic Fleet prepared for the moment when their presence in the Orient would assume far greater importance. For if a major war in the Pacific were touched off, it was readily apparent that war would be to a great extent a naval war. Whether the U.S. Asiatic Fleet could hold its own in Far Eastern waters against a large enemy force was debatable, but the men stationed at Cavite were determined to give it everything they had. For peace in the Pacific, time was running out. Early on December 8th, Japanese pilots prepared to take off for the glory of the Emperor on the strikes which would plunge the Pacific world into a catastrophic war. When Nippon embarked on its program of large-scale conquest, its forces were ready to lash out immediately at a number of targets of prime importance. From Japanese bases on Formosa soon after daybreak, the advance guard of the attacking forces started south. Only 270 miles away lay the great, sprawling Philippine archipelago. The attack plan called for strikes against a number of U.S. airfields scattered throughout the islands. As the planes flew southward on their mission, ships of the Imperial Navy were already moving in the same direction. The Japanese had assigned an overwhelmingly strong fleet of warships to the operation, just in case U.S. naval units should elect to contest the Nipponese invasion of the Philippines. But the Japanese attack force was not challenged. In those early moments of World War II in the Pacific, it seemed to the men of the assault groups that a Japanese victory would surely come to pass. For this was the moment they were convinced that Japan was destined to succeed in the divinely inspired plan to rule the earth. Any nation which opposed the expansion of Nippon must be dealt with by the forces of the rising sun. How unfortunate for the enemy that he should be foolish enough to oppose the Emperor's warriors. In little more than 12 hours, the invasion of the Philippines would be launched. Japan's program of conquest had been set in motion. The fate of the Pacific world was in the balance. The Japanese invasion of the Philippines was conducted on schedule.